Welcome to Everyday Tarot, your daily dive into the divine wisdom of the tarot. I'm your host, Camille A. Saunders, and today I'm talking about the moon. Whether you're a seasoned tarot reader or just starting to explore, this podcast offers daily insights, intuitive messages, and practical advice drawn from the cards. Each episode is designed to help you connect with your inner wisdom, find clarity in your decisions, and tap into the energy of the universe. Tune in every day, Monday through Friday, for fresh perspectives and empowering guidance from the tarot as interpreted by me. The best way to support the podcast right now is to listen daily, rate, review, and to follow or subscribe in your chosen podcast app. The next best way is to check out my Patreon. Supporting me there gives you early access to upcoming podcast episode topics, digital downloads I've created, and monthly tarot hangouts with me and other listeners. The link is in the show notes to check that out. You can always go to my website, CamilleASaunders.com/everydaytarot for all the latest information related to the podcast and to find images of the cards I pull on each episode. If you're local to the greater Puget Sound area of Washington State, I'd love to see you at one of my Let's Talk Tarot meetup group events where we all bring some of our favorite decks and play around with tarot and oracle decks together. In my next event, which is coming up on the 24th of February, we're going to be actually crafting our own tarot cards together, so you can come and learn how to do that with me. I'll bring all the supplies and we'll get to craft together. All right, so on to our main discussion. So welcome to season 3 of the podcast. In the first season, I introduced tarot through talking about oracle versus tarot cards, myths of tarot, how to find a deck, reading for yourself versus others, and much more. In season 2, I started going through the first 13 cards of the Major Arcana, one per episode, and now we're on to season 3, where I go through the final 9 cards in the Major Arcana and talk about each suit. And today I'm talking about the moon. The number associated with the moon as the Major Arcana card is 18. So numerology for the number 18 is about breaking free from limiting beliefs, embracing true potential, blessings, humanitarianism, building something to last, and fulfillment. Traits associated with 18 are tolerance, generosity, self-determination, and integrity. All right, so let's get into some common depictions of this card. So this card's called the moon, so often there is a literal moon depicted, sometimes shown as like a crescent moon, sometimes shown as a full moon, or sometimes interpreted in other ways. Often the moon is about like subconscious or unconscious things. So sometimes there's things that go along with that theme. Sometimes you see a dog and a wolf, which are representing the tamed and the wild parts of self. Sometimes there's 2 pillars. So again, representing the line between unconscious and the waking state. And sometimes there's even a crab or a crawfish, which is supposed to be about signifying a slow evolution into enlightenment, ascent from murky waters onto dry land, and then into air and spirit. And that last description comes from the Library of Esoterica tarot book by Toshin. So they go through every card and talk about different symbols associated with the card, qualities, attributes, and then also have usually about 10 examples of cards from different decks that are all the moon. So again, that's really nice. So in this book, it talks about that the moon is about being through the gates. The moon shows us that the illuminated soul has now to turn itself over to the dark night once more, making its spiral way through the labyrinth of the unknown in order to reach a new level of awareness and ability to heal. The pull of instincts is the only sign that lights the way to mastery, and the outcome is as uncertain as any throw of the oracle. And this is a quote by Vicki Noble from Rituals and Practices with the Mother Peace Tarot, and that quote is in the Toshin book. So yeah, if I pull up some of my decks that I have in the Sassarabita Tarot deck by Stasia Burrington, there's a crescent moon depicted. It's sort of like transposed over someone's face who looks like they're crying. And then there's like stars in the background. It's clearly nighttime, and the person is very like blue-gray looking, so a lot of like dark colors. In the Goddess of Love tarot deck, there's a goddess there. I believe it's Hathor, but I'll have to see when I get to the deck book description. The goddess is holding like a full moon over their head. And then there's Four pillar. Well, no, I think two pillars, on one on either side. There's sort of like some white flowers at the bottom, and then there's it's a beetle, like a gold beetle. Makes me think of like the Mummy, the movie. At the top, and then sort of above the beetle, there's like pink, almost like indicating like the rising sun or something like that. And then below the beetle, which is most of the card, is this like watery blue. So I'm imagining again sort of like the subconscious below there. And then in the Therapist Who Tarot deck, um, I would say it's like sort of a loose depiction of the moon. It has lots of circles on the card. There's some like blue and purple and gray colors. There's like a dark gray circle in the middle. And then there's sort of a larger oval that has, again, some different colors in it, some dots, some swirls. And then there's sort of these lines that go vertically at the bottom of the circle there. And in this deck, there is a word below the title of each card. So for the moon, it says fear. And this deck also has questions on the back of the cards instead of having like a tarot deck guidebook. So the questions on this card are: what sacrifice are you glad you made? What is it time to end? And how have you betrayed yourself? So that sort of gives us an indication of where we're going with the meanings of this card. So I got into it a little bit with the Toshin, like symbols and description there. But again, they talk about like usually there's a full moon on the card. Again, it's sometimes a dog and a wolf stand. They call them as sentinels. In some decks, they're shown howling up to the lunar light. The two animals represent the wild and the tamed, the duality of human nature, the loyal and the feral existing side by side. Some older decks include two astronomers in the scene observing the heavens. In others, a woman rides a horse-drawn carriage across the sky, a crescent moon resting in her right palm. It says in the most popular depiction, a small crustacean appears just emerging from the pond in the foreground. The crab or crawfish is a signifier of the slow evolution, like I talked about earlier. And then far away, twin towers or pillars guard either side of the trail, representing the line between unconscious and waking state, good and evil, and all the possibilities that stretch in between. So when we get into meanings of this card, again, there's sort of this unconscious, this sort of like the revealing hidden truths, right? If you think about what happens when there's a full moon, like the reason we can see the full moon is the sun is shining on it in a specific way that it illuminates the whole part of the moon instead of only seeing parts of it or none of it. And so it's also about like illumination, or sort of things that are maybe underneath that we don't always see. And interestingly, I'm recording this on February 12th, and there's a full moon today. So this card feels very relevant right now. And again, I would say the moon card is often seen as the next card in the Major Arcana is the sun. And the sun card is usually very happy, positive, like all of daytime. We live in a very like sun focused culture, which is sometimes why I think, right, we're not super into talking about grief or some of the darker aspects of life. And so the moon card can kind of get this reputation for being, right? I mean, on the Therapist Who Tarot deck, it talks about fear. In one of the cards, they're crying. Like in the Goddess of Love Tarot one, I would say like this imagery gives a little more positive vibes, but often it is a very like sort of a negative card, or at least some people feel that way about it. It can be about like transformation, thinking about intuition instead of just like rationality or logic. It talks about the moon reminds us to be aware of the difference between illusion and reality. So, sort of again, like thinking about the idea of the sun reflecting light onto the moon, like shows us different fullness of the moon, right? The moon is always there, whether we can see it or not, or how much of it we can see. But the sun really impacts, right, like what our interpretation of the moon is. And it's always changing. And so the moon also symbolizes like dreams, intuition, the watery subconscious. It's the, like, if the sun is seen as the masculine card, this is seen as like the counterpart, the feminine card. Um, Connecting with the divine, worlds beyond the veil. So again, there's this sort of like underlying tone of like the underworld, grief, like being associated with death or like hidden things, being like, again, literally underground or being this counterpart to the sun. Right. And again, if you think about it, right, the sun rises and sets every day. Again, we can't always see it if it's cloudy or things like that, but if the sun wasn't there, humankind would not exist, right? The planet would be very cold and very dead in a lot of ways. And if the sun were to ever go away, we would not have a great time, as would a lot of creatures on Earth. It would be very cold. And so when we think about the moon, right, like the moon is there, but right, it can illuminate aspects of the night. Again, if we're on a full moon, I went outside last night and it was very bright. Again, if you're not like paying attention to the moon, you would be like, wow, there's like a spotlight out there. Why is it so much brighter tonight? It was, I could still see the stars really well and actually some planets, which was very cool. Um, but also, right, the moon waxes and wanes, right? Again, it's our perception of it. It doesn't actually change. It's always a full sphere up there above us, but it looks like it does. And right, the tides are associated, right? The reason we have tides is because of the way that our planet interacts with the moon and as it pulls from the different poles on Earth. So there's a lot of like change and like tension, I would say, almost like associated with the moon card, which again, I think is why it can sometimes get like a bad rap. As someone who is a moon worshiper, I'm like, I love the moon card. I like analyzing dreams. I like talking about things that are more taboo or that other people don't like talking about. I'm a therapist. I'm training to be a sex therapist, right? Like these are a lot of things that are not um, totally talked about in our culture or seen as like normal conversations to have in day to day. So maybe that's part of my own particular bias about the moon card. But it is interesting to think about like um, what's your relationship with the moon? Again, I think a lot of people don't necessarily pay much attention to it. I think those of us that are witchier or spend a lot of time outside or in nature, right, kind of see the different ways that the moon impacts our lives. I know for me, again, like I feel like I always am a little bit like buzzing around the time of the full moon. But also there's this sort of level of like often I don't sleep as well, right? Sometimes it's like it's because it's literally brighter outside at night. And also it's like this tension, I think, between like energy and exhaustion that often comes up around full moons, at least for me, generally. And so it can be like very potent energy. We're in a Leo moon right now. So Leo is also very strong, associated with the lion, associated with the sun, interestingly. Um, and so, right, that might be maybe there's a little bit more, I don't know, energy or again, tension kind of coming up with this full moon than maybe there usually is. I'm going to pull the Fearless Tarot book as well by Elliot Adam, How to Give a Positive Reading in Any Situation. Because again, I like to look at this book for some of the cards that are maybe seen as not as positive to pull or that kind of thing. So this book talks about that the moon is all about unconscious influences. It symbolizes our instincts and our unconscious emotions. The deep undercurrents can alter your perception of the world around you. If you harbor habitually negative emotions, you will look at the world and constantly see evidence of negativity. Likewise, if you're brimming over with positive energy, you will see a world full of joy. The moon reminds you to check in with your unconscious moods and feelings. These emotions are coloring your perception of the good or bad things you're seeing in front of you. And then they have some like reflective questions about what color would best describe your emotions today. Are your emotions a healing blue, a depressive gray, a heartfelt pink, a sunny yellow, an emerald green, or a dirty yellow green? Have you been feeling a bit moody lately? The moon beams brightly in the sky, pulling on the instincts of the animals on the card in very mysterious ways. Again, like I talked about earlier, there's often a wolf that appears in the image howling at the moon. The wolf represents the primitive, instinctual side of nature. A domesticated dog sometimes appears alongside the wolf, and the dog represents your civilized self. I don't love some of this language, but we're going to go with it. So think about like what's the dog doing on the card. Sometimes the dog is howling at the moon, just like the wolf is. And so this sort of represents that no matter how maybe like rational or intelligent you might like to think you are, you're still being pulled by the mysterious and other forces. The moon is a force of nature that tugs on your deepest instincts and emotions. And again, I think this is part of why the moon card sometimes is not totally seen as a positive card, because if you were sort of either not in tune with your emotions or maybe feel like your emotions are really big and you kind of wish that they were smaller and less impactful, um, the moon card sort of like points that out, right? It's sort of like, again, it kind of pulls on our emotions. It can sometimes make things feel bigger. Sometimes we might feel moodier around the full moon. I know my mom as a nurse would talk about that working in the hospital, like there's always a lot more stuff going on a full moon, a lot more people in the emergency room in the hospital, and sort of like not sure why, but just that it seems like that's true. Um, and we feel like the moon, right? The moon tugs on Earth's gravity as it orbits, and right, it affects the oceans and lakes and rivers as the moon like circles, creating the tides. Also, I know there's like a commonly spouted fact of humans are, made up a large percentage of water. And so it's possible that, right, that the way that the moon pulls on the large bodies of water on Earth also affect our human bodies as well, because we have so much water in them. And the moon really tugs on our instincts. So sometimes when this card appears, right, maybe it's time to listen to your deepest feelings and let them guide your path. So instead of, right, shoving them down or feeling like, oh, I'm being so irrational or like this or that, like, what if you actually, right, listen to them and see where they want to take you? Tune into those intuitive hunches. Trust yourself when something doesn't feel right. Reconnect with your wiser, magical self. Like the lobster emerging from the depths, let your deeper wisdom rise to the surface and bring valuable insights to your conscious mind. When the moon appears, it's time to trust your impressions, hunches, and instincts. With time and practice, your intuition will grow sharper and guide you through any challenge. Right? Many people in our modern society would like to think the rational mind is the only foolproof way to experience reality. However, it's undeniable that we're creatures of nature and instinct. Sometimes people don't act rationally. I would say oftentimes people don't act rationally, despite our best efforts. And sometimes there's no logical explanation for why something occurs. Sometimes signs do present themselves on our path. Sometimes we need to tune in to the undercurrents that are shaping the realities we experience. So you possess great depth, and it's time to allow it to emerge. So all of that came from, again, the Fearless Tarot book by Elliot Adam, How to Give a Positive Reading in Any Situation. So in the Sacerobito Tarot deck by Stasia Burrington, in the guidebook for the moon card, it talks about the moon's considered a romantic and beautiful yet poor source of light. As such, it's considered to be full of illusion and prone to fantasy. The card's associated with sleep patterns and dreams, so fabrication, deception, and a lack of clarity. The moon can be associated with your shadow self and tendencies to project your fears and insecurities onto others. Imagine your ideals, examine them to see if they're unrealistic. Use intuition and creativity as your guides. Things may not be as they appear, so cross-examine any assumptions you have, which I think is a great way to sort of like think about the moon card. Again, like allow those emotions to come up, allow your intuition to guide you. And then also, right, make sure like you are not just necessarily taking things as they physically appear or maybe as someone tells you immediately, right? If someone says something and you get this feeling of like, I know what they're saying like seems good, but then maybe I'm getting this like weird feeling underneath, right? Think about your assumptions, think about what they're saying, and then really listen to yourself and your body as well. So I feel like that's a lot about what this card is about. Again, we talked about kind of the questions with the therapist's tarot deck. What sacrifice are you glad you made? What is it time to end? And how have you betrayed yourself? So again, thinking about, right, like what have you lost in the past, right, with sacrifice? Like what are you glad that, right, you made a choice about? What is it time to end? So maybe like unhelpful patterns or behaviors or things that you just feel like I'm over it. Like I just need to decide, right? Set that boundary. And how have you betrayed yourself, right? And I think sometimes, right, our literal dreams that we have or our subconscious, like will bubble those things to the surface. And again, it can be sort of easy in our society and culture to just like push that down because we're very much told that's not important. We don't quite know what dreams serve us for, like why we have them. Maybe it's a level of processing, right? Something that happens with our brains when we sleep that needs to happen. But also, right, examining like, yeah, what is it we want? What is it that might be going on, and how maybe have you, right, either lied to yourself or betrayed yourself, or thinking about like maybe you set a boundary and then you let someone cross it, or you didn't kind of tell them when something happened, right? These are ways that we can betray ourselves. And even though other people might really push our boundaries, right, it's our job to protect ourselves in that way and to make choices and decisions and tell people when they're not doing things or when they're doing things we don't like, and then to set the boundary for ourselves and change our own behavior because we can't control other people. We can only control, right, our choices and the ways that we do things. All right, and then in the Goddess of Love tarot deck, so there's a lot on this card, and like I said, I think it's depicting Hathor. Okay, I'm right. I'm excited about that. So it's the moon again. It's the number 18. The goddess on this card is Hathor, and the astrological correspondence is Pisces. Which for some reason makes sense to me because I think of the moon as a watery card and Pisces is a watery sign. But I don't actually know exactly why that one is. And it talks about to enter the realm of the erotic divine feminine requires a disbanding of the logical mind. This isn't cerebral, it's intuitive. The moon is the shadow, the pain, the sorrow, the nightmarish, and the intensity of life. It's the darkness of the dream world and the immense trust required to follow your heart, even if you don't know why you're being pulled in the direction you are. The moon's one of the most ancient symbols of the goddess. The Egyptian goddess Hathor has been worshipped for more than 6,000 years as a goddess of love, music, sensuality, and art. In her guise as cow-headed goddess, she represents the creation of the Milky Way, and as a solar goddess, she represents duality. Just as the full moon reflects the light of the sun, so does Hathor radiate light. The moon nods to a period of intense transformation that may or may not end up with a clear outcome, or even a dark night of the soul. It's an invitation to honor and to follow your intuition. Through the lens of the erotic, the moon transforms into the temple of the heart, into the space it takes to come back to love. Surrender to your gut feelings and to the magic within. Embrace the pain and confusion of connection, trusting in the ebb and flow. And then the affirmation she talks about with this one is I follow my intuition towards my heart, toward my purpose, toward the temple of the goddess and love. And for journal questions, she suggests, what are my heart and gut asking me to listen to? So again, it's really about listening to yourself, right? Sort of listening to your gut feelings, the energy and the emotion that comes up, and not trying to intellectualize your emotions or rationalize your way through something, but to actually feel it and examine it from that lens, which can be scary, I think. It's not really, I would say again, what we're really taught in Western culture a lot of the time. It's very much about logic and rationality and book smarts and where's the proof and all these things. And oftentimes with intuition, like there isn't proof. Um, right? We can ask for signs, we can ask for guidance, we can follow our emotions and kind of see what plays out. But oftentimes, like, there is not cold, hard proof. Because again, it's about choices. So if you made a certain choice, right, like you don't actually know what would have happened if you had made the other choice. We can assume, we can infer, we can, yeah, try to guess, or we can see what other people and the choices they make and see what happened with them. But again, right, we're all our own individual people and have different experiences. So you don't really know what it's going to be like until you try it yourself. And I think that's like a good welcoming to us with the moon card is to think about, right, like how do we trust our own emotions? How do we trust our instincts and our intuition um, as another thing that's telling us things that are true? And again, sometimes we're not quite sure why that's happening, or it doesn't become clear until maybe much later what was going on. But I think that, right, this is also the sort of like feminine aspect of this card um, that often gets downplayed in our society of like trusting intuition. All right, so let's dive in and see what the cards have to say in relation to the moon. All right, so today I'm pulling from the Ophidia Rosa Tarot deck by Leela and Olive, and I pulled the Ace of Swords. And when I look at this card, it has a single sword on it, and it has some leaves and like purple, muted purple flowers. Aces are usually about beginnings or beginnings of a journey or starting something new. Right? We think of them as sort of like the number one in the suit when it goes from ace to 10, and then it goes right, and then kind of the face cards, so the other cards there. So again, the Ace of Swords. So in this deck, there's just really a phrase about each card. So I'm going to read it probably a couple of times and then see sort of what my interpretation is. And as I pulled this card, again, I was thinking about some of those questions from the Therapist Who Tarot deck related to the moon card, like what sacrifice are you glad you made? What is it time to end? And how have you betrayed yourself? So for the Ace of Swords, it says, the clarity to cut where sunlight meets shade. Behold, yet beware the double-edged blade. The clarity to cut where sunlight meets shade. Behold, yet beware the double-edged blade. The first thing that kind of stood out to me was the like sun meets shade, just because thinking about, again, in the context of the moon card, right, again, the sun reflects on the moon, which is why we can see it at night. So it's really making me think about, right, the sun is sort of like in charge of how much light of the moon that we see at a time. To the clarity to cut where sunlight meets shade, behold, yet beware the double-edged blade. So also about clarity, I feel like this is maybe sort of what I was talking about right at the end with the moon card, of that there's this idea of like rationality versus intuition or emotions. I feel like this card is saying that that's sort of like drawing a line down the middle, right, with the sword, and saying that like there's emotions on one side and there's rationality on the other, or sort of proof or logic or scientific method on the other. That is a bit of a double-edged sword. That when we create a duality, that we sort of say that it can only be one or the other and that you can't actually hold both things, which I think is why, right, again, when the moon card comes up, it's kind of like, oh, that's about intuition. Oh, it's about wateriness and the underworld and the subconscious and dreams and the confusion of like what it's telling us. And I just want it to make sense. And so I feel like this card's telling us, like, yes, right, like it can be helpful to think of logic and intuition as separate things and being clear about that. And also that when we do that, um, right, it can kind of cut us on both sides, right, the literal double edged sword of feeling like, right, if you say that it can only be one or the other, then it makes it seem like emotions aren't true or your intuition, if it can't be proven or if someone else doesn't understand it, that it's not true or real, and that's also a harmful way to look at things, because intuition is real, at least I think so. And I feel like you have to like believe and hone your own intuition too and allow it to come forth. And I know for me, that was like a process to go through or something that I felt very out of touch with my intuition for a long time. And it took different years and different experiences to try to figure out like how to listen to my body or how to listen to my inner knowing and what it was telling me, and to put boundaries or sort of disregard other people's experiences when I was experiencing something else. All right. Okay, so links for the tarot decks that I talk about will always be in the show notes and on my website if you'd like to look at them or purchase them. And then thanks for joining me today on Everyday Tarot. Just as a reminder, the podcast comes out daily, Monday through Friday for all of 2025. See you soon. Bye-bye.